right, thanks everyone for being here. My guest on stage with me is Bill Silva. Bill is best known to many of us as the promoter for the Hollywood Bowl, but as we dig into Bill's history, there's so much more than that. So Bill's the owner of Bill Silva Entertainment, which has produced over 10,000 shows from small clubs to major stadiums all over the world. His reputation, as I've got to know, has been kind of a good person in an industry that's not necessarily known for good people, or that's often filled with sharks. And so maybe we'll talk about how some of that happens. But Bill's also built an impressive career in management, working with everyone from Blink-182 to Jason Mraz, and running Machine Shop for Linkin Park, which is how we met. Bill also has investments in music and tech, and is a member of Techstars Music. And so, as I said, we met through Linkin Park. Bill hired me to head up brand partnerships, and we had the opportunity to work together for a couple of years and went through some incredibly tough times personally and professionally there. And I had kind of a front row seat to see Bill's leadership style and how he was able to move with grace and put other people first. And so I'm really excited, Bill, to have you for this talk. I think in some ways you're the perfect person to talk us through a bit of what's happening now and what might be on the other side, as we were talking about just before this. So thank you.
Well, thanks, Josh. I'm thrilled and not at all surprised that you wanted to put this together and create conversations in the industry and resources for people to reach out to. I mean, that's how I've gotten to know the man that I know you as somebody who takes conversation, dialogue, and relationship and moves it into actionable ways to enhance everybody's relationships and experiences. So I'm grateful to be here and really happy to support you and try and pull this together.
I really appreciate that. And I think, it's a great point that, I know, just to speak for myself for a second, tough things happen. It's easy to let our minds go to really dark places. And I think as humans, we have trouble with uncertainty. And so when we don't know what's around the corner, it's sometimes really easy to imagine the worst. And I think for me, it's those relationships. It's the people that I trust and can count on that kind of get me through those things. And so you being one of them. And so I'm excited to kind of talk a bit about that. But, as I said in the intro, you've had a long and storied history. You've been at the top of the live music game for a long time, but I'm sure there's tons of ups and downs. And, you've lived through crises, both, I imagine personal, but also, on a global scale, whether it was the financial crisis in 2008 or other things that affected that. I'm curious, how does this compare? How is it the same or different, what we're going through now? And are there lessons that you've taken from earlier times that are helpful to you now?
Wow, that's a loaded question. Let's dissect it a bit, because I think one of the things we're experiencing at this time, which is unprecedented in recent time, is that you're dealing with a health crisis at the same time as it's impacting daily life routines and economic output. And I think in the past, for instance, in the 80s, and early 90s, I lived through the HIV/AIDS inception. Yeah. And so that was clearly a health crisis, but it didn't stop the world and its economic activity in the same way. It was a fairly select and selective virus, if you will. Whereas this one is pandemic. It's affecting everybody, and it doesn't matter if you're young or old or whatever. And so the way to arrest it is to look at prior pandemics, whether it's the 1918 Spanish flu or the bubonic or whatever, where everybody went into quarantine and you try to starve this thing out over time, which obviously impacts economics. So I'd say, but ironically, I was thinking before we talked about how, as I was growing up and as an early businessman, and over the years I've read different financial people that I try to follow, like Warren Buffett or whoever, I've seen this maxim that most successful people don't get there without either losing it all a couple of times or being on the verge of losing it all a couple of times.
Sure.
And I had a little chuckle because I thought it's truly been my story. I mean, over and over, I've been at the point where financially I thought I was facing ruin, and through business decisions or through circumstances, through unprepared, moments like these where whatever you might have prepared for, it's just proportionate beyond what you could have imagined. And so, I'm here to tell you that one of the things that's hard for us to separate, I think for all of us, is that as a provider, as somebody who creates value, as somebody who creates jobs, I want the people in that community who work with me and who my family and those kinds of people, I want them to feel safe and secure.
Yeah.
And I can't always do that. And that's one of the most heart-wrenching parts emotionally for me in this kind of a time, right? Is doing that. But what I can do, what I've learned to do in time, is to say that, to say, I'm nervous. Everything's not rosy today. Like we may have a little rocky time ahead of us, or be clear. And I think that when you're talking about uncertainty in the preface, I hate uncertainty. I would much rather have bad news than uncertainty.
Sure.
And so what I've taken away from that over time is that part of my communication style, hopefully with my peers and my family and whatnot, is to say, I realize this is an uncertain time. I acknowledge this is an uncertain time. I don't have the answer, but here are the steps I'm going to try to take today. What do you guys think, right? And invite collaboration, because what I've realized is that, from the most unlikely places do we get solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's a great insight. And I want to just go back to something you said at the beginning. So, I was about 12 when we started learning about HIV and AIDS. And it was on the news every night. I grew up in San Francisco, where obviously it was epidemic in certain communities there. And, what you saw in the news, for people who, might be too young to remember, or we've just forgotten, is that, there were wild predictions about the death toll that AIDS was going to take. And there were nurses and doctors refusing to treat patients because they thought that even being in the same room with somebody exposed them and put them at risk, right? And that was a time of great uncertainty, right? And it was, and since then we've learned that, well, that's a terrible and very serious disease, but it also didn't wipe out all of humanity, and over time has been able to, be contained to a certain extent, and the uncertainty has been removed from that situation, right? But it's not that different. The disease, whatever, is very different to coronavirus. But the wild speculation, the hysteria that we were seeing in the media, in casual conversations, the reaction to the uncertainty is frankly not that different. And
yeah, we also learned that if we changed behavior and approaches, we could affect it. And it didn't require quarantine; it just required, some thoughtfulness and communication. But I'll remind you, here we are 40 years later. There's still no vaccine for HIV. Yeah. There's a lot of treatments. There's a lot of very positive treatments, but there's no vaccine. And I'm not saying that there won't be for coronavirus, because clearly other coronaviruses, the seasonal flu, there are vaccines for. So I believe science, technology, the world focus will get us there. I'm just saying, here we are 40 years later. And
that's a great point. And I think it really speaks to the fact that, we have no control over the external conditions around
100%.
Whether this thing dies out or whether it's there's a vaccine or any of that. Nobody knows, but we can control our own response to it. And so you talked a little bit about that. Tell me more about, I know you have young staff and some of your businesses who have never been through something like this before. What are those conversations, and how are you helping them or kind of seeing them go through this?
One of the things that I've tried to do in the last few years is to sort of model the behavior. So I realize that I'm being watched. And so what I want to do is show up every day in the right frame of mind to be able to lead, to be able to, and sometimes leadership is just listening. It's not necessarily coming up with solutions. Sometimes it's listening. I've got, really bright, creative people around me, great business partners. And a lot of times it's encouraging them to speak up and not stay in their, shell shock or fear, because what this kind of a time creates for all of us is fear. And exactly what you were saying about the HIV era, when we're locked in fear, it's very hard to be creative and be in any sort of problem solving. And I think that when you look at some of the things that have come up during this time, I know I'm veering off topic a little bit, but if you look at the creativity that's sprung up from our artists who are natural entrepreneurs, and our best entrepreneurs are natural creatives, right?
Yeah.
They've declared they're not going to be locked in fear, and instead they're going to create. Because if you're creating, it's almost impossible to be in fear. It's just a different emotion. It's a different mindset. And so, whether it's Mike Shinoda, who's on Twitch every day with a broadcast and creating songs with his fans, and Chris Martin, who started the live stream thing, or Gaga, who pulled together the world to do something with Hugh Evans. Whatever it is, people are creating an emotion. It's impossible when you're in that space to do that. So that's what I've been trying to do. I'm working on a couple of new businesses that we're starting up right now.
Cool.
Bizarre. None of them to deal with COVID or that sort of thing, but that helps me. It stimulates a part of my brain that's creative. I've tried to lean into masterclass. I really like masterclasses. I really like TED Talks. I really like reading. I find that when I'm reading, it opens up a creative center that's not activated in the same way. So one of the best books I've read recently is by Dr. Larry Brilliant. It's called Sometimes Brilliant. And Larry was one of the doctors with the World Health Organization who went to India and helped eradicate smallpox. And he was also on Ken Kesey's bus, and Wavy Gravy's his best friend, and he helped the Grateful Dead start a nonprofit called SIVA. He's hippie and scientist and an unbelievable guy. And the book is incredible. What a great journey. So those are all the lessons I take away. So how do I show up? I try to show up and encourage them, all the people who work with me, to stay creative, to stay building on things. If things don't exist now, how can we create the things that could exist that people will be able to benefit from our time and our process?
Yeah. That's really interesting. There's another, those sound great. And there's another one you mentioned to me the other day when we were talking. I think it's Finding Mastery, the podcast.
The podcast. Yeah.
Day. And so I listened to the one you mentioned, Jeremy Jones, who's the snowboarder and leader in climate change, fighting climate change. And, there's something in that episode that kind of made me think about what you just said. And it was that, in snowboarding, right, he found people, colleagues, friends who were so immersed in that subculture that it sort of negatively impacted their mental health. And he talked about addiction and suicide and some of those issues from people who were almost like too in it and too just focused on their own passion. And I think the message was when you can't break out of that, when things don't go the way you want, and that's all you have, then you've got problems. Certainly in music, we see a lot of those same mental health issues. Do you have any thoughts on that, and kind of how, again, if you're just immersed in music and live music right now, and that's your whole perspective, it seems like that's going to be a tough road mentally.
100%. And I think that mental health is often exactly what you just said. It becomes a lack of perspective. And perspective, I think there's been so much pressure from so many angles for all of us over time about what success is and what that looks like and how we fit into that and where we are on the ladder of it.
Mhm.
And I think it's easy in those judgments to lose perspective. And so I think that, again, I go back to creating and creativity, and as an entrepreneur, I've done so many things that I thought it's probably not a great idea, or this may be the best idea ever, and they haven't worked out the way I had hoped. But man, the joy of creating, the fulfillment of trying, and of getting other people passionate and sparked up to join in on it.
Yeah.
I mean, what a great experience that is, over and over and over again. So, I just keep falling back on that. And I think we're seeing it with some of our live promoters, whether it's the drive-in movie theaters that are being used for concerts. Our good friend Toby in Germany has been, trying to get that off the ground in Germany for a little bit.
Yeah.
I know Denmark has just recently pulled it off, but you're seeing, we're seeing those creative entrepreneurial promoters and live music people wanting to connect fans and artists and getting together, and they'll come up with new ways to do it, things we haven't even imagined yet today.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned, live streaming, which obviously, a lot of artists are turning to, and I think promoters are getting in on that as well. Are you seeing signs that there's a business there, or I'm struck by, there's a ton of free stuff and some fundraisers, and it seems all good. And certainly from the perspective of just creating and connecting with people, I think it's important. I think, also the longer this goes on, more and more people are going to need revenue streams that don't exist today. And so I'm wondering if you see, are there signs that stuff is starting to emerge, or is it just experimentation at this stage?
I'm happy to see it as a form of expression. I don't see it in its format today as a monetizable business or a massively monetizable platform. I think that a lot of artists will be able to make connection with their fans, and through that emotional connection, there will be some transfer of value, some tips, donations, whatever it may be. I think that, but I don't. I think everybody wants to be out. If you look at the scenes of the beaches in Huntington Beach, people want to be out together, and I think that this is fine. It serves a purpose right now. And over time, my guess is that the form will become elevated. And look, I think the most exciting thing out of all this is watching Travis Scott and what he did with Fortnite, and Epic Games have been, so in front of everybody with that. And then, when you look at Animal Crossing and, what's going on in there in the island environments. And so I almost think that the escapism of those vehicles that allow us to connect together, but in a escapist way, is likely to be an accelerating trend that will be monetizable, as opposed to, let me go put my concert on the screen, which now is a screen that's in your house on your computer or something, as opposed to that big TV thing that we used to put them up on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, you brought something up, the beaches are they would be full, or they are in some cases. As you said, people definitely want to be out and want to be together. I think there's also a lot of speculation that about when live entertainment, live music specifically, is going to reopen, what that will look like. Will people feel comfortable showing up and sitting in a venue, with other people? I'm always suspicious when I see the headlines or the articles that seem to have it all figured out, because I think there's no way you have it figured out. But where does that sit with you? Obviously, you have a stake in that.
Well, look, I think there's so many stakeholders in those decisions, and I think we have to start from the regulatory side. And it certainly in California doesn't seem like there's going to be a lifting of anything that would lead me to believe we might have 18,000 people together this fall. There's been some very light conversation, but no regulation, no guidelines, nothing. But the very early discussions were, well, maybe if you could do every other row and every other seat and have hand sanitizers, and all the workers could be wearing masks, and then the people wearing masks. It's basically it's an unactionable
Sure.
solution for us. So I mean, let's take just the Hollywood Bowls for instance. We typically need 90 to 95% of the seats sold every night, and we need platinum pricing, and we need sponsorships. We need all this stuff to work in tandem to make it work to pay for everybody that's on site working and to pay the artists. And so to go down to some percentage of that capacity just isn't going to be tenable for us. So I don't see us having enough regulatory on-ramp to decide that in 2020 we're going to be doing shows. Hope I'm wrong, but I just don't believe it.
Sure.
This could extend into 2021 easily and well into 2021, if not to 22, given if the government really believes large gatherings should not take place until there's a vaccine. Guess what? We're waiting around for a vaccine and one that's in mainstream production. So given all those things, how do I, as an artist manager or a business manager of artists, say, you know what, guys, we're going to be good by October 20, June 21, whatever it is. Go spend a few $1 million, hire everybody. I'm going to rent the buses and trucks for you. Let's go hire the set designers, build them out. We already know the insurance companies aren't accepting the risk.
Mm-hmm.
The promoters have limited capacity at this point to take on any more risk. Right. And I don't think as an industry, we can ask the consumer to take the risk. So if we keep the consumer out of the risk game, and this is all shared among insurers, artists, and promoters, I know that everybody else thinks the promoters should take the risk. And I know the promoters, that's our role. But how do we mitigate? How do we come up with a reasonable risk?
Sure.
As for me as a human and a libertarian, if you will, which I'm not really, but do I think people should be given the option to make the choice if they want to go into a crowd of people and participate in an activity? I do. Mm-hmm. I think we're supposed to be smart. We're supposed to make educated guesses.
Yeah.
We're supposed to have these civil liberties. That's the edge I err on. Seeing a lot of people at a beach, I may not make the choice to go to that beach if I see that many people on it. Yeah. But I'm not necessarily opposed to people being on the beach. Mm-hmm. I just hope they're not going home to their older grandparents, parents, or family member who might be immunosuppressed and become compromised as a result.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point. It really, this pandemic really illustrates just how linked we all are in society. And so it certainly brings up these fundamental issues of, free will, our own decision, freedom to make decisions versus the impact that it has on our community.
Yeah.
And all that. And I think, again, anyone that thinks there's an easy answer, I think is wrong about that because they're nuanced and they're complicated. Yeah. But, you talked about something, again, relative to the community. And so as a business owner, it's not just about protecting your own business and, selling tickets and the revenue because you have vendors, you have partners, you have an important partner in the Hollywood Bowl. And in order for your business to survive or thrive long-term, you need those partners to some extent to be healthy as well. And so how do you, how do you navigate that? How do you sort of, I don't want to get into the, private details of your business, but how do you decide who gets paid and who doesn't and what gets renegotiated and just how do you think about those conversations?
Well, again, I think there's a risk profile to this, and I think it's a completely new risk profile. This isn't something, we're in a long-term relationship with the LA Philharmonic for the Hollywood Bowl. There are landlords basically.
Right. And,
the risks that we take on in that relationship typically would be, all right, the economy might hit a recession for a couple of years. Nonetheless, we know that there's a certain amount of rent that's going to be paid, and they know that they can count on that being paid. Yeah. And we know that our ticket sales may not be robust in that kind of a time. This is a completely new playbook for everybody. They're suffering just like we are. We certainly don't want to add to their suffering, but it's an unprecedented time in terms of what the solutions might be. So we count on having robust long-term partnerships where we can have open and honest dialogue and try to come up with solutions maybe help everybody, which might mean some temporary pain for one or both of us, and some, some other solutions we hadn't imagined when we embarked on our latest term together.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Are you? I'm anticipating a bit of shuffling the deck in terms of who's got the power in these relationships between artists, promoters, venues, managers, agents. Obviously, we're seeing some of the layoffs and furloughs happening already at some of those companies. I'm hearing talks about some people raising money to go invest and roll up, and so my guess is that we see a very different industry in 2, 3, 4 years in terms of who the players are and what power each of them holds. Is that something you're thinking about, or are you kind of playing the cards that are in front of you right now?
To me, that's sort of like financial opportunism and arbitrage, and I'm not interested in that. I'd be much more interested in creating, something that people can benefit from, which that may be in a way. It's not the lane that I'm looking to be in. I don't know that the players are going to look that much different, but there could be new players. And in terms of the balance of power, honestly, I hope there isn't a power struggle, if you will. I think that we really require everybody at the table working on the solution. We can't do it without each other. And I think that, it goes back to what you were saying about, the personal choices we make about if I'm going to quarantine or not quarantine. It's the same in the business. I think anybody who wants to take the stance that I'm owed, I'm entitled, everybody else, send it my way, I don't think that's going to be the best. And it's certainly not going to be a sustainable position in the next 24 months. Yeah.
So maybe in closing, just thinking about that and thinking about how, we were talking before this about small changes that we're seeing already, whether it's just getting more comfortable with video chat, and kind of how we relate to each other when we're all sitting in our living rooms, et cetera. What do you hope to see on the other side of this? What gives you some kind of hope and optimism as we go through this?
I think humans are resilient, and I think we've seen it over and over again. And this was the latest and next example of what resilience is going to bring. I'm loving the time I've had to be on my FaceTimes and Zoom calls with my family. We live all up and down the West Coast. Yeah. I'm the oldest of 7. I got 12 nephews and nieces. And we've had wonderful connection through that. And I'm sure there's many families that are being reunited, sure, in new ways. So I hope entertainment will continue to nourish the spirit, help bring us together. And I hope that I know that we will continue to count on our artists to lead the way in terms of speaking up and speaking out, and the other thing I know, having been through a number of these different things over 40 years in the business, is it's all going to work out. We're going to get to the other side of it. We're not going to die in this thing. We're going to get to the other side. There will be a new something, and whether it's new normal or new picking up from where we left off, whatever it is, we will get there. Mm-hmm. And it's just going to require some ingenuity along the way, and probably some extra lifting for some people. I don't think we can count on the money machine's going to turn back on right now, and we probably all need to be looking for other ways to supplement, to make sure that the family's healthy, that the people we need to provide for are healthy. That we're going to be able to make it through some extended period of time. And I know that's not easy, but the government's not going to be able to do it all for us. And we certainly have enough entrepreneurial minds in this business for people to be jumping out there to figure out what those things will be.
Absolutely. Well, that's a great note for us to close on. Thank you.
Thanks, Josh.
For those You delivered everything I'd hoped for and more.
Well, thanks for setting this up. I think it's an incredible resource for everybody.
Awesome.
Great thing. Yeah.
Thanks, Bill.